He looked at his wife, exhausted, bleeding on the hospital bed 3 minutes after delivering triplets, and handed her divorce papers. 10 years of marriage. She'd coded his first software, designed his logistics model, worked double shifts to pay for his Wharton MBA. He threw $50,000 at her like it was trash and walked away from his newborn children. But Christopher Hernandez made one fatal miscalculation. He didn't know the penniless orphan he just discarded was the sole heir to a $14 billion empire. And 5 years later, when she walked into his boardroom as his new boss, the real reckoning began. Have you ever been judged by someone who had no idea who you really were? Keep that question in mind, because Sarah Rodriguez was about to teach the world a lesson they'd never forget. The rain battered against the reinforced glass of the VIP suite at Mount Sinai Hospital in New York, drowning out the distant hum of the city below. Inside, the air smelled of antiseptic and exhaustion, a metallic tang mixing with the sharper scent of blood that hadn't quite been scrubbed away. Sarah Rodriguez, technically still Sarah Hernandez, for another few minutes lay propped against stiff hospital pillows, her body feeling like it had been run over by a freight train. Her dark hair was matted to her forehead with sweat, her face pale and stripped of any makeup she might have worn earlier that day. The hospital gown clung to her skin, damp and uncomfortable. Beside her bed, 3 clear plastic bassinets lined up in a row, each containing a tiny, fragile infant hooked to monitors that beeped in rhythmic dissonance. The whoosh of oxygen through delicate tubes filled the gaps between beeps. Jacob, Ryan, Emily. She'd named them while Christopher was in the hallway, his voice carrying through the door as he closed some deal that couldn't wait even for the birth of his children. Sarah's trembling fingers reached toward the nearest bassinet. The label read, "Baby Boy A. Rodriguez," in utilitarian hospital print. Inside, a 4-pound infant with translucent skin struggled with each shallow breath, his chest rising and falling too fast, too fragile. An oxygen tube was taped carefully to his tiny nose. "Jacob," she whispered, her voice hoarse from hours of screaming during labor. The epidural had worn off before the C-section, but the anesthesiologist had been delayed with an emergency 2 floors down. She'd felt more than she should have. The door opened without a courtesy knock. "Don't get too attached, Sarah." The voice cut through the mechanical symphony of beeping monitors like a blade through silk. Sarah's head turned slowly, her neck stiff and aching. Christopher Hernandez stood at the foot of her bed, and he looked nothing like a man who'd just become a father. His charcoal Brioni suit was immaculate, the kind of perfection that came from dry cleaning that very morning. A Patek Philippe Nautilus watch, $87,000 she knew because she'd been with him when he bought it to celebrate the Sanchez merger talks, caught the harsh fluorescent light. His Bruno Magli shoes were polished to a mirror shine. His hair was perfectly styled, not a strand out of place despite the March rain outside. The cologne he wore, Tom Ford Oud Wood, cut through the hospital smell like an invader. His eyes were cold, flat, the way he looked at quarterly earnings reports when the numbers disappointed him. "Christopher." Her throat felt like sandpaper. "They're here. Look at them. Please look at our children." He didn't look. Instead, he stepped aside with the practiced efficiency of a man revealing a PowerPoint slide, and there in the shadows near the door stood Donald Thomas, Christopher's personal attorney, Brooks Brothers suit, leather folder clutched to his chest like a shield. The expression on his face was the kind of discomfort that came from knowing you were participating in something morally bankrupt but legally sound. "I've seen them," Christopher said, checking his watch as if he had somewhere more important to be. "Small, frail. Frankly, this timing is inconvenient." The word hung in the air between them like a guillotine blade. "Inconvenient?" Sarah's mind struggled through the fog of morphine and exhaustion. "I just gave birth to your Sarah." Christopher walked to the bedside, his movements sharp and deliberate, and placed a thick document on the swinging tray table. The paper was still warm from the printer in Donald Thomas's briefcase. "We need to be realistic. Hernandez Technologies is hemorrhaging cash. The stock price is in free fall. The merger with Rebecca Sanchez and her father's financial group is the only thing standing between us and bankruptcy. She has requirements." The name hit Sarah harder than any contraction had. Rebecca Sanchez, the blonde woman Christopher had hired 6 months ago as chief branding consultant. The one who wore Louboutin heels to tech meetings and looked at Sarah like she was a particularly dull piece of furniture that needed to be replaced. The one whose LinkedIn profile listed her father as Harrison Sanchez, chairman of Sanchez Financial Group, with a personal net worth north of $300 million. "What are you saying?" Sarah's voice barely rose above the beeping of the monitors. Christopher picked up the document and held it directly in front of her face, close enough that she had to pull back slightly to focus on the words. Dissolution of marriage. Hernandez versus Rodriguez. The header was printed in bold, horrific clarity. "You're divorcing me." It wasn't a question. The reality of it settled into her bones like cement, hardening cold and permanent. "I'm saying Rebecca won't play stepmother to an orphan's litter." Christopher's voice dropped half an octave, the tone he used when he wanted to sound reasonable while saying something unconscionable. "And she certainly won't marry a man who's still tethered to a—" He paused, selecting his words with the care of someone picking through garbage with tongs. "Lower middle-class housewife." Donald Thomas stepped forward from his position near the door, his shoes clicking softly on the linoleum floor. He placed an open Mont Blanc pen on the tray table next to the divorce papers. The pen was expensive, elegant, and completely at odds with the brutality of what it was meant to accomplish. "Mrs. Hernandez, Ms. Rodriguez, the settlement is generous." His voice carried the practiced neutrality of a man who'd delivered bad news to people who couldn't afford to fight back. $50,000 cash. Full custody of the minors to you with complete termination of Mr. Hernandez's parental rights and obligations. Sarah stared at the number printed on the paper. $50,000. 10 years ago, before she'd met Christopher at that tech networking event in Brooklyn, before she'd fallen in love with his ambition and his smile and his promises, $50,000 would have seemed like a fortune. But she'd been living in this VIP suite for 3 days now. She'd overheard the nurses discussing NICU costs during their shift change just outside her door. $8,000 per day. Per infant. For triplets born 6 weeks premature with underdeveloped lungs and dangerously low birth weights. The math was simple and devastating. "You're divorcing me." She repeated the words because her brain couldn't quite process the magnitude of what was happening. "Today. Right now. 3 minutes after I gave birth to triplets. I'm being generous, Sarah." Christopher tapped the paper with his manicured fingernails, each tap precise and measured. $50,000 is more than you've ever seen in your life. It'll get you a studio apartment in Queens, maybe even a 1-bedroom if you're smart about it, or wherever people like you end up. The casual cruelty in the phrase "people like you" landed like a slap. "And the children," her voice cracked on the word splitting down the middle like kindling. "Full custody to you." Christopher said the words coming too quickly rehearsed. "I surrender all parental rights. No visitation. No financial obligation beyond this settlement. I don't want them. Rebecca doesn't want them. They're baggage, Sarah. Expensive, loud baggage that will drag down everything I'm trying to build." He leaned closer, and the cologne that had once seemed sophisticated and expensive now smelled cloying and toxic. His breath was coffee stale. "If you sign now tonight, you get the $50,000. If you fight me, if you make this difficult, Donald here will bury you in legal fees until you're living in a homeless shelter and begging on street corners." His eyes flicked toward the monitors, toward the 3 tiny lives struggling in their plastic boxes. "And I'll cancel the hospital payment authorization on my way out. You know what NICU costs are for triplets. You'll be in debt for the rest of your life, multiple lifetimes." The threat was delivered with the casual efficiency of a man ordering lunch. Sarah looked at the 3 bassinets. Jacob shifted slightly in his sleep, his tiny fist clenching and unclenching like he was fighting an invisible enemy. These children, barely 6 hours old, had no idea their father was negotiating their abandonment like a bad stock trade, like shares he wanted to dump before they tanked completely. "Why?" The word tore itself from her throat, raw and desperate. "I supported you when you were nothing, Christopher. When you were just another programmer with big ideas and no money. I worked double shifts at Romano's Diner to pay for your Wharton MBA application fees. I wrote the code for your first logistics algorithm while you were networking at conferences I couldn't afford to attend. I designed the hub-and-spoke model that made Hernandez Technologies viable in the first place. I built you up from nothing." Something ugly twisted across Christopher's handsome features, a sneer that made him look like a stranger. "And you served your purpose perfectly. But let's be completely honest with each other for once, Sarah. You're a nobody. No family, no lineage, no connections worth having. You were a placeholder, a practice wife until I was ready for the big leagues." He uncapped the Mont Blanc pen with a soft click and shoved it into her shaking hand. "And I'm ready now. Rebecca brings $200 million in capital and access to networks you couldn't even begin to understand. You bring student loan debt and a GED." The cruelty was surgical in its precision, calculated, every word chosen to cut as deep as possible. Sarah looked down at the pen in her hand. It was heavy, substantial, the kind of object that signified wealth and power. Then she looked at Christopher's face, at the man she'd loved for a decade, the man she'd believed in when no one else did, the man she'd sacrificed everything to support. Something inside her, the naive, hopeful part that had believed love and loyalty mattered more than money, shattered completely. The sound it made was silent, but she felt every shard embedding itself in her chest. In the place where that soft, trusting part of her had lived, something cold and hard began to form, something crystalline and sharp. She didn't scream, didn't beg, didn't cry. With a hand that shook so badly she could barely control it, she took the pen. "You will regret this." Her voice came out different than before, steady, cold, steel wrapped in silk. Christopher laughed, a short bark of sound that held no humor whatsoever. "I regret a lot of things, Sarah. Wasting 10 years on someone who couldn't keep up with me, not ending this sooner. But getting rid of you." He shook his head. "That won't be one of them," she signed. Sarah Rodriguez. The ink was barely dry when Christopher snatched the papers from the tray table. He didn't glance at the bassinets, didn't pause to look at Jacob or Ryan or Emily, didn't kiss them goodbye or whisper any promises he'd never keep. He just turned on his expensive Italian leather heel and strode toward the door with the confident gait of a man who'd just closed a successful business deal. Donald, leave the check on the table. The attorney placed a certified check for $50,000 next to the plastic water pitcher, gave Sarah a look that might have been pity or might have been nothing at all, and followed his employer out of the room. The door clicked shut with a finality that seemed to echo longer than it should have. Silence rushed back into the space like water filling a vacuum, the beeping of the monitors, the whoosh of oxygen through tiny tubes, the distant sound of rain against the windows, the city below indifferent to her pain, continuing its relentless forward motion. Sarah was alone, divorced, homeless in 3 days when the hospital discharged her. A single mother of 3 premature infants who needed round-the-clock medical care she couldn't afford. She pulled her knees toward her chest, and the C-section incision screamed in protest, a white-hot lance of pain that made her gasp. For the first time since labor had begun 36 hours ago, she let herself cry. Not the quiet, dignified tears of someone maintaining composure, the guttural, heart-wrenching sobs of someone whose entire world had just collapsed. But even as the tears fell, even as her body shook with the force of her grief, her eyes caught on the window. The reflection showed a broken woman, yes, devastated, abandoned, alone. But somewhere behind the grief, in the deepest part of her that Christopher had never been able to touch, a spark remained. Survival. What nobody in that hospital knew, what Christopher Hernandez in his expensive suit and his cold calculations couldn't possibly have known, was that in exactly 21 days, Sarah Rodriguez would inherit a fortune so vast it could buy his entire company 10 times over and still have enough left to fund a small nation. And the woman weeping in that hospital bed would become the most dangerous enemy he'd ever made. 3 weeks crawled by like years. The basement apartment on Girard Avenue in the Bronx was technically classified as a converted storage space, which was a generous interpretation of reality. 180 square feet of concrete walls that sweated moisture even in winter, a single narrow window at street level that showed nothing but feet walking by, boots, sneakers, heels clicking past at eye level. The smell of damp concrete mixed with boiled cabbage from the upstairs apartment and the sour milk scent of formula that had been spit up and imperfectly cleaned from every available surface. Sarah sat cross-legged on the bare concrete floor surrounded by the wreckage of her new life. 3 laundry baskets from Goodwill, $4 each, lined with donated blankets and serving as makeshift cribs. 47 diapers left in the generic brand bulk package. 9 cans of Infamil formula at $32 each, and she was rationing them, watering them down slightly, even though she knew she shouldn't. The $50,000 check sat on the floor next to her uncashed, staring at her like an accusation. The stack of medical bills had its own corner. $187,492.18. NICU care for 3 premature infants over 18 days. The hospital had been clear the bills were her responsibility now. Christopher had canceled his authorization the day he'd left the hospital, exactly as he'd threatened. The eviction notice was 2 days old, $800 a month rent, and she was already behind. Jacob was crying again, that thin, reedy wail that premature infants made, a sound that cut through everything else and went straight to the primitive part of her brain that screamed danger. Help them fix this. She rocked him on autopilot, her body moving even though her mind had gone somewhere else entirely. She hadn't slept more than 90 minutes straight in 21 days. Her eyes felt like they'd been rubbed with sandpaper. The C-section incision still throbbed, a constant reminder of everything she'd lost. The calculator next to the check showed the math she'd done 17 times, hoping the numbers would somehow change. Deposit on this basement, $8,000, first month, last month. Security deposit that the landlord had demanded in cash because her credit was non-existent. NICU bills, $187,492.18 already in collections, destroying what little credit she'd had. Formula for 3 months, $3,456. Diapers for 3 months, $1,200. Utilities, $450 per month. Total after 3 months, negative $153,598.18. She was drowning. Christopher had known it. That's why he'd offered exactly $50,000, just enough to make her think she had a lifeline, not enough to actually survive. The television in the corner was a 13-inch screen with rabbit ear antenna she'd bought at a pawn shop for $30. The reception was terrible, the image fuzzy and prone to static, but it worked well enough to deliver the news that made her stomach turn. And in business news, Hernandez Technologies shares surged 18% this morning following the announcement of CEO Christopher Hernandez's engagement to Rebecca Sanchez, heiress to the Sanchez Financial Group. The power couple is set to wed in a lavish ceremony at the Meadow Club in Southampton next month. The screen showed Christopher smiling, his arm around a woman who looked like she'd been carved from ice and money and expensive plastic surgery. Rebecca Sanchez. Blonde hair that moved like it had been individually programmed, a Cartier necklace that probably cost more than Sarah's entire existence, skin that had never known a day of real work. Sources close to the couple say the merger will inject $200 million in fresh capital into Hernandez Technologies, saving the struggling firm from potential bankruptcy and positioning it for aggressive expansion into the artificial intelligence sector. Sarah stared at the screen, at Christopher's face, at the way he looked so completely happy, like he'd forgotten she existed, like Jacob and Ryan and Emily were phantoms he'd successfully exorcised from his life with a signature and a check. "He forgot us, baby," she whispered to Jacob, who had finally quieted against her chest. Just like that. 10 years, 3 children, and we're just gone. The knock on the door was heavy, authoritative. The kind of knock that meant official business, the kind that made her heart spike with panic, even though she'd done nothing wrong except be poor and alone. She'd been expecting the landlord, hoping for a few more days of grace. "Ms. Rodriguez." The voice that came through the cheap wooden door was unexpected, deep, gravelly, but with the crisp precision of a British accent. "My name is Kenneth Clark. I am a solicitor from London. I need to speak with you regarding your biological heritage." Sarah froze. Jacob still clutched against her chest. Heritage. The word made no sense. She'd been found in a basket on the steps of St. Jude's Catholic Church in Queens on November 3, 1998. No note, no identification, just a blanket with an embroidered hawk holding a key and a birthmark on her left shoulder shaped like a crescent moon. The state of New York was her heritage. Foster care was her family tree. She opened the door a crack, the chain still engaged. The man standing in the dim hallway looked like he'd stepped out of a Victorian novel. Three-piece tweed suit that was clearly Savile Row, even if Sarah didn't know enough about men's fashion to identify it specifically. A silver-topped cane that seemed more accessory than necessity. A face lined with what had to be 70 years of serious business, but eyes that held something unexpected. Kindness, maybe, or pity. "I don't have money for whatever you're selling," Sarah said, exhaustion making her blunt. "And I don't have heritage. I have a social security number and a birth certificate that says mother unknown. That's it." "May I come in?" Kenneth Clark's eyes scanned what he could see of the apartment through the crack in the door. His expression didn't change, but something flickered across his face. "It concerns the late Richard Whitmore." Sarah's hand tightened on the doorknob. Richard Whitmore. Everyone knew that name, even people who didn't follow business news. Shipping magnate, real estate baron, the kind of old money that had old money. He'd owned Whitmore Shipping Lines, one of the largest freight companies in the world. Prime real estate in London, Manhattan, Tokyo, Singapore. He'd died 2 months ago, and the tabloids had been full of speculation about his will, about who would inherit an empire worth billions. "You have the wrong Sarah Rodriguez," she said, moving to close the door. "There are probably 1,000 of us in New York alone. You were found in a basket on the steps of St. Jude's Catholic Church in Queens on November 3, 1998. Kenneth spoke quickly, pulling a leather folder from his briefcase with practiced efficiency. "You were wrapped in a blanket with specific embroidery, a hawk holding a key. You have a birthmark on your left shoulder shaped like a crescent moon." The door handle went cold in Sarah's hand. Nobody knew about the birthmark. She'd never told anyone except Christopher years ago when they'd first started dating, and everything had still been new and full of promise. "How do you know about the birthmark?" Her voice came out barely above a whisper. "Because Ms. Rodriguez." Kenneth said, his tone softening in a way that made her throat tighten. "Your mother, Catherine Whitmore, had the same one. Please, may I come in? What I have to tell you will change your life, but I'd prefer not to do it in a hallway." 10 minutes later, Sarah sat on the edge of her sagging mattress, the only real furniture in the apartment besides the rickety wooden chair Kenneth now occupied. Jacob, Ryan, and Emily slept in their laundry basket cribs, the soft sound of their breathing the only thing keeping Sarah tethered to reality. The floor between them was covered with documents. Birth certificates she'd never seen before, sealed records that should have been impossible to access. DNA test results showing a 99.97% match to Richard Whitmore. Photographs yellowed with age showing a woman who looked so much like Sarah, it was like staring into a mirror that showed a different timeline. Catherine Whitmore, young and beautiful, holding an infant. "Your mother was Richard's only child." Kenneth explained, his voice gentle but precise, the tone of someone who'd delivered life-changing news many times before. In 1996, she fell in love with an artist, Miguel Rodriguez, a painter from Brooklyn who showed his work in small galleries and barely made enough to cover rent. Richard forbade the relationship. He was a difficult man, old-fashioned in the worst ways. Miguel had no money, no family name, no connections. Richard told Catherine she would be disinherited completely if she married him. Sarah stared at the photograph of her mother, at the woman she'd never known, at the face that could have been her own. "She ran away," Kenneth continued, "changed her name to Catherine Rodriguez, married Miguel in a courthouse in Queens with 2 strangers as witnesses. Had you 9 months later. But 6 weeks after your birth there was a car accident on the Queensboro Bridge. A truck driver fell asleep at the wheel. Both Catherine and Miguel died on impact." Sarah's hand came up to cover her mouth, but no sound came out. "You survived. You were in the back seat, secured in a car seat that your father had installed with the kind of precision he brought to his paintings. But there was a clerical error at the hospital. Your mother had been using a false name. There was no identification on either body. You were processed as Jane Doe infant. The system lost you. You ended up at St. Jude's and from there into foster care. And Richard, Sarah finally managed to speak. He just let me disappear. He spent 23 years looking for you. Kenneth pulled his reading glasses from his vest pocket and opened the will to a marked page. He hired private investigators, searched hospitals, orphanages, foster care records across 3 states. He was a cold man to the world, Ms. Rodriguez, but his regret over Catherine consumed him. When he died 2 months ago, his will was extraordinarily specific. Everything goes to the child of Catherine Whitmore if found and verified through DNA analysis. The word everything hung in the air like a promise too large to comprehend. Everything. Sarah's voice cracked on the word. Kenneth adjusted his glasses and began to read from the document in a tone that suggested he'd memorized these words. The Whitmore estate includes Whitmore Shipping Lines, a global freight operation with 247 vessels. Whitmore Maritime Holdings, with headquarters in London, New York, and Singapore. A prime real estate portfolio including properties in Mayfair, London Park Avenue, Manhattan, and Roppongi, Tokyo. A 40% equity stake in Vandermeer International Bank. And liquid assets, bonds, and securities totaling. He paused, looked at Sarah over his glasses, and delivered the number that made the basement apartment spin. Approximately $14.2 billion, the world stopped making sense. Sarah looked at the peeling paint on the concrete walls, at the generic formula cans stacked in the corner, at the $50,000 check that was supposed to sustain her and 3 infants through an impossible future, at the television still showing news footage of Christopher and Rebecca celebrating their engagement at some restaurant that probably charged more for an appetizer than Sarah paid for a month of formula. $14 billion. I'm sitting in a basement that smells like cabbage, she heard herself say, her voice distant and strange. Rationing formula, trying to figure out how to pay $187,000 in medical bills with $50,000, and you're telling me I'm a billionaire. $14 billion, Kenneth corrected gently, plus the position of CEO of Whitmore Maritime Holdings should you choose to accept it, though I should warn you there is a condition. Of course there was a condition. There was always a condition. Richard didn't want his heir to be a pushover. Kenneth continued, his tone shifting to something more serious. The estate is currently being managed by a board of 12 trustees. Men who were loyal to Richard, yes, but men who have grown comfortable in their positions of power. They expect you to be a naive girl from Queens who will be overwhelmed by the magnitude of the inheritance. They've already positioned themselves to offer you a buyout 30 cents on the dollar for your shares, which would still make you wealthy by any reasonable standard while they maintain control of the actual company. He leaned forward, and Sarah saw something in his eyes that looked almost like respect. If you want the company, Ms. Rodriguez, not just the money, but the power, the control, the ability to actually run the empire your grandfather built, you have to take it. You have to learn this business from the ground up. You have to walk into that boardroom in London and prove to 12 men who've never respected anyone without the right pedigree that you're a Whitmore. You have to fight. Sarah looked down at her hands. They were rough from years of waitressing, chapped from washing dishes and changing diapers, shaking from exhaustion and malnutrition because she'd been giving most of her food to the babies through breast milk. Then she looked at the 3 laundry baskets. At Jacob and Ryan and Emily, the children Christopher had called baggage. The children he'd discarded because they were a financial burden and a social embarrassment. If she accepted this inheritance, if she became Amanda Whitmore instead of Sarah Rodriguez, she wouldn't just be rich. She wouldn't just be comfortable. She would be powerful enough to crush Hernandez Technologies without breaking a sweat. To make Christopher Hernandez understand exactly what he'd thrown away. To show Rebecca Sanchez that the waitress she'd sneered at was worth 100 times what the Sanchez family fortune could ever dream of reaching. The exhaustion that had been dragging at her for 3 weeks suddenly drained away, replaced by something electric, something cold and sharp and utterly focused. Sarah stood up and Kenneth rose with her recognition dawning on his face. "Mr. Clark," she said, and her voice was steady for the first time in 3 weeks. "What do I need to sign?" Kenneth smiled, a thin expression of approval that suggested he'd been hoping for exactly this response. "Just this." He produced documents from his briefcase with the efficiency of someone who'd prepared for this moment. "And then we must get you out of this place immediately. The Whitmore penthouse on Park Avenue has been prepared and staffed. I've arranged a team of nannies, night nurses, pediatric specialists, and security personnel." Sarah took the pen he offered. It was a Mont Blanc, heavy and expensive, nothing like the cheap plastic pen Christopher had shoved in her hand in the hospital. She signed Sarah A. Rodriguez. The A stood for Amanda, her middle name, the one she'd always hated because it sounded too fancy, too pretentious for a foster kid from Queens. But now, "One more thing," Sarah said, looking at the television where Christopher's face was frozen mid-laugh. "Nobody can know about this. Not yet." "Anonymity is often the most effective weapon," Kenneth agreed. "I need to disappear completely." Sarah walked to the cracked mirror hanging on the wall, looked at her reflection, gaunt, exhausted, broken. "Sarah Rodriguez needs to die, right here in this basement." "Then who will you be?" Kenneth asked, though his expression suggested he already knew the answer. Sarah touched her reflection, traced the outline of her face. She needed to change everything. The face, the body, the voice, the presence. She needed to become someone else entirely, someone Christopher would never recognize until it was far too late. "My middle name," she said softly. "From now on, I'm Amanda Whitmore." She turned back to Kenneth, and he saw something in her eyes that made him take an involuntary step back. Something cold and calculating and absolutely merciless. "And Mr. Clark, I need you to get me the best business tutors money can buy. The best stylists, voice coaches, personal trainers. I have 5 years of work to compress into 6 months." She picked up the photograph of her mother, Catherine Whitmore, and studied the face one more time before setting it down with careful deliberation. "I'm going to buy Hernandez Technologies. And I'm going to make Christopher Hernandez regret every single decision that led him to that hospital room." 5 years dissolved in a montage of transformation that would have seemed impossible if anyone had been watching closely enough to notice. The Park Avenue penthouse was a limestone building from the 1920s, all Art Deco elegance and old money discretion. The doorman wore a uniform with gold trim and treated Amanda like royalty from the first moment she arrived, even though she was carrying a laundry basket with Jacob and looked like she'd been living in a basement for 3 weeks, because she had been. Standing in the foyer with its 16-foot ceilings and the Picasso on the wall that was probably worth more than the entire building she'd just left, Amanda felt small and lost and completely out of place. "This is your home now, Ms. Whitmore." Kenneth's voice was gentle but firm. "I don't belong here." The words came out as a whisper. "Not yet," Kenneth agreed. "But you will." The education began immediately and was more intense than anything Amanda had experienced in her life. Harvard Business School professors made the trip to New York for private tutoring sessions that lasted 8, 10, sometimes 12 hours straight. The dining room table became a war room covered with financial statements, case studies, merger and acquisition strategies, maritime logistics models, international trade law. At 3:47 in the morning on a Tuesday in June, one of the professors found Amanda still awake, surrounded by notes and coffee cups, her handwriting getting progressively worse as exhaustion set in. "Most MBA candidates take 2 years to learn this material, Ms. Whitmore." Amanda looked up, her eyes red-rimmed but focused. "Then I won't sleep." The physical transformation was equally brutal. Dermatologists on Park Avenue worked on her skin with microneedling and chemical peels and laser treatments that left her red and raw for days at a time. The hair salon charged $800 per appointment to transform her dull brown hair into a glossy black asymmetrical bob with razor-sharp lines that framed her face like a weapon. Personal trainers at Equinox put her through sessions that left her shaking and nauseous, but slowly her body changed from soft and exhausted to lean and powerful. A stylist from Bergdorf Goodman came to the penthouse with racks of clothes, boxing up her beige cardigans and replacing them with Alexander McQueen power suits and Tom Ford dresses and Chanel jackets that cost more than she used to make in 6 months of waitressing. The voice coach was a professor from Juilliard who made her repeat the same sentence 100 times until the Queen's accent disappeared completely and was replaced with a transatlantic lilt that could have belonged to anyone from anywhere. The board will accept my proposal. First take uncertain, the accent still clinging to her words like mud. The board will accept my proposal. 10th take better, more controlled. The board will accept my proposal. Final take ice-cold command that made the professor break character. Jesus Christ, you're terrifying. The children grew in parallel to her transformation, and watching them develop became both her greatest joy and her deepest pain. Jacob's first birthday was intimate, just Amanda and the triplets, and the nannies in the Park Avenue living room with an expensive cake that Jacob mostly smashed with his hands. Ryan's second birthday found Amanda teaching him to count still dressed in her business suit because she'd just come from a meeting. Emily's third birthday meant reading bedtime stories with all 3 children piled on her lap, a rare moment of softness in an otherwise hardening existence. By their 4th birthday, Amanda's face had been sculpted by the best surgeons money could buy. Subtle work that enhanced rather than transformed, making her look like an elevated version of herself rather than someone else entirely. Her smile with the children was still genuine, still real, but everything else about her had calcified into something harder. Their 5th birthday party in April of 2024 showed how much everything had changed. The children were sophisticated now, shaped by British nannies and private tutors. Jacob read chapter books and spoke with a slight British accent. Ryan played chess and could hold conversations about strategy that would impress adults. Emily corrected grammar and carried herself with the confidence of someone who'd never known poverty. London became Amanda's second home, or perhaps her first. The private jet with the Whitmore Maritime logo on the tail made the crossing so often the pilots knew her coffee order by heart. Whitmore Tower was glass and steel and 47 floors of power overlooking the Thames. The boardroom on the top floor seated 12 men who'd been waiting for her with barely concealed contempt. They were all in their 60s and 70s, Savile Row suits and decades of entrenched power, and they looked at the 25-year-old woman who walked in wearing an Alexander McQueen suit and a $4 million diamond choker like she was an amusing inconvenience. "Miss Rodriguez," one of them began, his tone dripping with condescension, "perhaps we should start with, 'It's Whitmore.'" Amanda's voice cut through the air like a blade. "And I'll start." The first year was war. They interrupted her presentations. They dismissed her ideas. They talked over her and around her and occasionally about her as if she weren't in the room. But Amanda had learned from the best tutors money could buy, and more importantly, she'd learned from a decade of watching Christopher navigate boardrooms while pretending she was just the supportive wife. By the second year, she'd fired 3 trustees for incompetence that was really embezzlement she'd uncovered through forensic accounting. By the third year, she'd acquired cobalt mines in the Congo that the board had said were too risky, and she'd been right, the stock jumped 40%. By the 4th year, she was on the cover of the Financial Times, "The Iron Lady of London, Amanda Whitmore, 30, reshapes maritime industry." By the 5th year, the same men who'd dismissed her were terrified of her hanging on every word she spoke. But the real work was happening in a different office late at night when the building was empty except for security. The wall was covered with everything Amanda had collected about Christopher Hernandez over 5 years of patient, methodical investigation. Organization charts showing every person who worked at Hernandez Technologies. Financial statements obtained through carefully legal but aggressive means. Rebecca Sanchez's spending records acquired through private investigators who knew how to exploit weaknesses in digital security. News clippings tracking the slow, inevitable decline. Hernandez-Sanchez merger struggles as cultural integration fails. Hernandez Technologies stock down 35% year over year. CEO Christopher Hernandez seeks outside investment for AI initiative. At her desk, Amanda used a red pen to circle key information with the precision of a surgeon marking an incision site. Debt: $280 million spread across Deutsche Bank, J.P. Morgan, and Vandermeer Bank. Project Titan: Christopher's last-ditch attempt to save the company through artificial intelligence requiring $150 million in capital he didn't have. Marriage status: rumored volatile. Rebecca controls the purse strings. Christopher desperate. Kenneth entered without knocking, the way he'd earned the right to do over 5 years of loyal service. The intelligence is confirmed. Hernandez is desperate. He's been quietly shopping for investors for 6 months with no success. Amanda pulled out a photograph she'd kept in a locked drawer for 5 years. Christopher and Rebecca's wedding at the Meadow Club in Southampton, both of them smiling like they'd won some prize. Her face showed no emotion as she studied the image, just cold calculation. Good. Desperate men make mistakes. She put the photograph away. It's time, Kenneth. Book the jet. We're going home. The next 3 months were a masterclass in corporate maneuvering that would have impressed the most ruthless Wall Street operators. Through 14 different shell companies: Phoenix Ventures in Delaware, Meridian Holdings in the Cayman Islands, Atlas Capital Group in Luxembourg, and 11 others. Amanda quietly acquired shares of Hernandez Technologies. Small lots purchased through proxy firms with different names, different geographic registrations, different patterns designed to avoid triggering any automated detection systems. The spreadsheet on her screen showed the accumulation in real time. Phoenix Ventures 8.2% of Hernandez Technologies. Meridian Holdings 6.7%. Atlas Capital 5.1%. Plus 11 others. Total 31.4% of all outstanding shares. She'd become the largest single shareholder of her ex-husband's company, and he had absolutely no idea. He thinks he's courting 14 different investors, she asked Kenneth, though she already knew the answer. Precisely. Each proxy firm has used different names, different backstories, different investment theses. He doesn't know that Phoenix Ventures, Meridian Holdings, and Atlas Capital are all you. Amanda allowed herself a small smile. Perfect. The Gulfstream G650 touched down at Teterboro Airport on November 15, 2024, exactly 5 years and 7 months after the night Christopher had handed her divorce papers in the hospital. Amanda descended the stairs, first wrapped in a white Loro Piana cashmere coat that cost $8,000, carrying a Hermes Birkin bag that cost $45,000, wearing Cartier sunglasses that hid eyes that had learned to show nothing she didn't want them to show. Behind her came Jacob, Ryan, and Emily, now 5 years old, and completely unrecognizable from the premature infants who'd fought for their lives in plastic bassinets. Jacob wore a navy blazer and already had a book open as he walked. Ryan bounced a ball with athletic precision. Emily led her brothers with the confidence of someone who'd been taught from birth that she was exceptional. Kenneth waited on the tarmac with a folder, and they moved directly to the Maybach with bulletproof glass. Inside the car, Kenneth delivered his briefing with the efficiency of a general reporting to a commander before battle. Hernandez Technologies. Financial status as of market close yesterday. Stock price $12.47 per share, down from $34.20 in 2019. Total debt $219. Total debt $284 million. Market capitalization $892 million. Quarterly losses $47 million. Investor confidence at critical lows. Christopher Hernandez's personal net worth $18 million, down from $240 million in 2019. Rebecca Sanchez maintains power of attorney over all joint accounts and requires her signature on any operating budget over $100,000. And the marriage? Amanda's voice showed no emotion. Volatile. Multiple sources confirm Rebecca belittles him publicly. He's seeking outside investment without her knowledge. If Project Titan fails, he's finished personally and professionally. And our position? Kenneth smiled. As of this morning, through our shell companies, we own 31.4% of Hernandez Technologies shares. We're the largest single shareholder. He has no idea. Emily leaned forward from the back seat, her British accent perfect and precise. "Mommy, why are we in New York? I liked London." Amanda turned, and her face did the only thing it still did, automatically softened completely when she looked at her children. "We're here to finish something I started a long time ago, sweetheart. Something about justice." Jacob, always the most perceptive, studied his mother with eyes that were too knowing for a 5-year-old. "Is this about our father?" Amanda had never told them details, only that their father had made choices and wasn't part of their lives. The fact that Jacob had figured it out anyway didn't surprise her. "What makes you say that? In your London study you have a photograph, a man and a woman in a laboratory. The man looks like Ryan. Sometimes late at night I see you looking at it, and you cry." The observation landed like a physical blow, but Amanda kept her expression neutral. She reached back and took Jacob's hand. "Yes, baby, this is about your father, but not about getting him back. It's about teaching him a lesson he should have learned a long time ago." Ryan, always practical. "Are you going to hurt him?" Amanda chose her words carefully, aware that what she said now would shape how her children understood justice and mercy and revenge. "I'm going to hurt his pride, his bank account, his reputation. But I'm not going to break him completely. Because if I did that, I'd be just as bad as he was." Emily, fierce, even at 5. "What did he do to us?" Amanda looked at her daughter, at the warrior she was already becoming, and told her the truth. "He threw us away, all 4 of us, because he thought we weren't good enough, because he wanted money more than family, and I'm going to show him exactly what he lost." The SUV pulled up to the Plaza Hotel, and the paparazzi were already waiting because Amanda's PR team had made sure they would be. Flashes, shouts. "Ms. Whitmore, are you in New York for business? Is it true you're looking to acquire American companies?" Amanda stepped out, coat-billowing sunglasses reflecting the cameras back at themselves. Children flanked by security that could have protected heads of state. She didn't answer questions, just walked through the revolving doors like she owned the place, which she could have if she'd wanted to, because the plaza was worth $600 million and she was worth $14 billion. That night, after the children were asleep and the nannies were watching over them, Amanda stood in the living room of the plaza penthouse suite that had been converted into a temporary command center. Laptops, documents, Bloomberg terminals showing real-time market data. Kenneth handed her an iPad with the guest list for tomorrow's event. The Gilded Age charity ball at the Metropolitan Museum. Guest list confirms Christopher Hernandez and Rebecca Sanchez will attend. They're desperate for donor connections. Amanda studied Christopher's photograph taken just last week. He looked older, stress lines etched, deep hair thinning at the temples. Nothing like the confident young man who'd smiled at her across a tech networking event 10 years ago. "Will he recognize me?" She asked the question she'd been asking herself for months. Kenneth studied her with the clinical eye of someone who'd watched her transformation from the very beginning. "You've changed everything about yourself except your DNA. Face, body, voice, accent, posture, presence. The exhausted woman in that hospital bed is dead, Amanda. You killed her." Amanda touched her face, felt the smooth skin that dermatologists had perfected, the sharp cheekbones that weight loss and subtle contouring had revealed, the jawline that had been softened just enough to look different without looking fake. "Good," she said, "because tomorrow night Christopher Hernandez meets his new investor, and he'll have no idea he's shaking hands with his ex-wife." She pulled out the garment bag that held the Valentino gown she'd had custom-made for this specific moment. Liquid gold fabric that moved like metal in motion, $47,000 of pure psychological warfare. "This is what I'll wear when I destroy his world." Tomorrow, Christopher Hernandez would come face to face with the woman whose life he'd shattered, but she wouldn't look like the broken waitress he'd divorced. She'd look like a goddess, and she'd hold his entire future in her diamond-covered hands, and he wouldn't know it until it was far too late to save himself. At 2 in the morning, Amanda stood at the window overlooking Central Park, watching the first snow of the season begin to fall. She couldn't sleep. Hadn't been able to sleep properly in 5 years, not since the night in the hospital when her entire world had collapsed. She opened her laptop and pulled up the file she'd been updating for 60 months. Operation Checkmate, Hernandez acquisition timeline. Phase 1. Gala encounter. Establish contact. Tomorrow Phase 2. Plaza meeting reveal debt position. Pending Phase 3. Brooklyn confrontation. Identity reveal. Pending Phase 4. Boardroom takeover. Final blow. Pending Phase 5. Redemption offer or complete destruction. To be determined. She closed the laptop and walked to the children's room. Stood in the doorway watching Jacob and Ryan and Emily sleep in the king bed they refused to be separated from because they'd been together since before birth and couldn't imagine being apart. Her whisper was so soft it couldn't possibly wake them. "I'm doing this for you, so you never have to wonder if your father loved you, because you'll know. He didn't. But I do, and I'm going to make sure the whole world knows what he threw away when he chose money over family." She closed the door softly and returned to the window. Manhattan glittered below her, the city where she'd been born, where she'd been abandoned, where she'd nearly died in a basement apartment while her children struggled to breathe. Now she owned pieces of it. Buildings, companies, influence that extended far beyond what money alone could buy. Tomorrow she would take back one more thing: justice. Amanda's reflection in the window looked like a queen preparing for war, and in every way that mattered, that's exactly what she was. The Metropolitan Museum of Art's Great Hall had been transformed into something out of a Gilded Age fever dream. 500 guests in gowns that cost down payments and tuxedos that required 6 months of tailoring floated across marble floors polished to mirrors. Ice sculptures 20 feet tall caught the light from crystal chandeliers. Champagne fountains imported from France flowed with bottles that cost more per glass than most people made in a week. A string quartet played Vivaldi from a raised platform, the music weaving through conversations about market movements and political donations and who was sleeping with whom. Christopher Hernandez arrived at 8:15, 15 minutes fashionably late, which was about the only fashionable thing left about him. The Tom Ford tuxedo was rented, not owned. He'd sold his custom suits 8 months ago when the margin calls had started coming in faster than he could answer them. The Rolex Submariner on his wrist was real, but he'd been to 3 different pawn shops in the past month, getting it appraised each time, walking out without selling it because it felt like crossing a line he couldn't uncross. His hair had thinned noticeably at the temples, stress accelerating what genetics had always promised. The lines around his eyes had deepened into canyons that made him look 45 instead of 38. Rebecca Sanchez walked beside him, but there was a chasm between them that had nothing to do with physical space. Her Valentino gown had cost $38,000, charged to the Hernandez Technologies entertainment budget under the creative accounting category of brand representation. The Cartier necklace at her throat was her father's, not hers. She'd quietly returned her own jewelry collection to cover gambling debts Christopher didn't know about because she'd gotten very good at hiding things. Her face had the smooth, expressionless quality that came from precisely calibrated Botox. Her eyes were dead in a way that suggested she'd stopped feeling anything about this marriage months ago and was just going through the motions until something better came along, or everything collapsed completely, whichever happened first. They stood near one of the champagne fountains, not speaking, Rebecca's thumbs moving across her phone screen with aggressive efficiency. Christopher's jaw clenched. "Can you put that away? We're supposed to be networking. We need capital, Rebecca." Desperately. She didn't look up. "I'm handling a crisis your incompetence caused. The Asian markets are opening in 2 hours and your tech stock is tanking. Again, go find some gullible fool to throw money at your little vanity project and leave me alone." The casual cruelty in her voice had long since stopped surprising him, but it still landed with the dull ache of a bruise that never quite healed. He hated her. Hated the way she controlled every dollar that flowed through their joint accounts. Hated the way she reminded him daily that she was the one with real money, real connections, real power, and he was just the husband who'd failed to live up to his initial promise. Sometimes late at night when he couldn't sleep because the stress had made insomnia his constant companion, Christopher thought about Sarah. Sweet, submissive Sarah who'd never questioned him, never challenged him, never made him feel small. It would have been easier with her. Boring, predictable lower class, but easier. Then the hush fell. Conversations didn't just pause, they stopped mid-syllable as if someone had pressed a cosmic mute button. Heads turned toward the grand staircase with the synchronized precision of iron filings responding to a magnet. The string quartet actually faltered for half a measure before recovering. "Who is that?" The whisper came from somewhere to Christopher's left, female, awestruck. He looked up. Amanda Whitmore descended the museum's grand staircase, and the world seemed to rearrange itself around her presence. The gown was liquid gold. Valentino custom-made $47,000 of fabric that moved like molten metal poured over her body. Backless daring cut with the kind of precision that suggested the designer had studied architecture before fashion. The diamond choker at her throat caught the light from the chandeliers and fractured it into 1,000 smaller stars. $4.2 million of Richard Whitmore's collection reset by Cartier specifically for this moment. Her hair was swept up in a chignon held by a single chopstick that was actually a Harry Winston diamond pin worth $180,000. Her posture was regal. Her walk had the predatory grace of something that had learned to hunt in boardrooms where showing weakness meant death. Her face was luminous, untouchable, the kind of beauty that came from excellent genetics, better dermatologists, and 5 years of learning how to weaponize every advantage. 2 security guards flanked her ex-SAS operators who'd worked protection details for heads of state and now worked for her because she paid better. Behind her, Kenneth Clark followed with his cane and 3-piece suit, looking proud in a way that suggested he'd had something to do with creating this moment. The crowd parted without anyone consciously deciding to move. The man next to Christopher, a hedge fund manager named Paul Moore, who controlled $8 billion in assets, spoke in an awed whisper. "That's Amanda Whitmore, the British shipping magnate. They call her the Iron Lady of London. Worth $14 billion last I heard, though it might be more now. Word is she's in New York looking for acquisitions. $14 billion. The number hit Christopher like electrical current, making his heart rate spike and his palms suddenly sweat despite the museum's careful climate control. This was it. This was the lifeline he'd been praying for. If he could charm her, if he could convince her that Hernandez Technologies was worth saving, if he could get Whitmore money backing Project Titan, he could finally get out from under Rebecca's control. He could be the CEO again, instead of the puppet whose strings were controlled by a woman who despised him. Amanda reached the bottom of the stairs and was immediately surrounded by people who wanted her attention. Senators, CEOs, society queens, who controlled charity budgets larger than some nations' GDP. She handled them with cool detachment, a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, responses that were polite but created distance rather than connection. Christopher pushed through the crowd with the desperate energy of a drowning man swimming toward a life raft. "Excuse me. Pardon me." He elbowed a Morgan Stanley vice president out of the way without apology. He reached the inner circle just as Amanda turned and their eyes met. The jolt that went through Christopher felt like static electricity amplified 1,000 times. Those eyes, hazel flecked with green in a pattern that seemed familiar in a way he couldn't quite place. Deja vu washed over him, made him momentarily dizzy, like he was standing in 2 moments at once. But the woman herself was completely untouchable. Her skin had the kind of perfection that suggested either incredible genetics or incredibly expensive medical intervention, probably both. Her posture suggested ballet training or military academy or both. She looked at him with an expression that mixed amusement and boredom in equal measure, like he was a mildly interesting insect she was deciding whether to study or crush. The question hung in the air between them, unspoken but clear. She was waiting for him to introduce himself, and somehow that simple act of waiting made him feel like he was the one auditioning for her approval rather than the other way around. Christopher deployed his most winning smile, the one that had closed deals and charmed investors and convinced Sarah to marry him a decade ago. Hernandez, Christopher Hernandez, CEO of Hernandez Technologies. Amanda extended a gloved hand, silk that went to her elbow, and when Christopher took it, the coldness of her skin penetrated through the fabric. "Ah, yes, the man who married the bank." The crowd around them tittered with barely suppressed laughter. Christopher's smile faltered for half a second before he recovered, but he felt heat rising in his face. That had been a barb, public, precise. designed to wound in a way that would leave no visible scar but would hurt every time he remembered it. "I like to think I bring my own value to the table, Miss Whitmore." She tilted her head, studying him the way a predator studies prey, deciding which angle of attack will be most efficient. "Do you—" "I've read your financials, Mr. Hernandez. They're quite imaginative. The creative accounting in your Q3 report was particularly inventive." Christopher felt sweat beginning to prickle along his hairline despite the museum's perfect temperature control. She was sharp, sharper than he'd expected. She'd actually read his financial statements closely enough to see through the optimistic projections and aggressive depreciation schedules he'd used to make the numbers look less catastrophic than they were. "Every empire experiences growing pains," he said, deploying the line he'd practiced for situations exactly like this. "We're on the verge of a major breakthrough with our artificial intelligence division, Project Titan. Perhaps we could discuss it over coffee sometime. I believe a partnership could be mutually beneficial." Amanda studied him for a long moment, and Christopher had the unsettling feeling that she could see straight through him, past the rented tuxedo and the rehearsed pitch and the desperate hope all the way down to the terrified man who was running out of options. "I am looking for investments," she admitted, stepping closer. Her perfume hit him then, a custom blend that probably cost more per ounce than Christopher made in a month. Jasmine and oud, exotic and intoxicating, the kind of scent that lingered in a room long after the person wearing it had left. "But I don't partner, Mr. Hernandez." Her eyes locked onto his with an intensity that made it impossible to look away. "I acquire. I take controlling positions. I demand complete transparency and absolute authority over strategic decisions." Christopher laughed nervously. "Acquisition is a strong word. We aren't for sale." Amanda's smile was slow and sharp, like a knife being drawn from a sheath. "Everything is for sale, Mr. Hernandez. It's just a matter of finding the right price. Isn't that your philosophy? You sell whatever doesn't serve your immediate needs." The words hit Christopher with an eerie familiarity, like something he'd said before but couldn't quite remember when or to whom. How did she know that phrase? Had he said it in an interview, at a conference? "I'm staying at the plaza," Amanda said, releasing his hand. Christopher hadn't realized he was still holding it. "Come to my office tomorrow morning, 9 a.m. Bring your pitch deck and your most recent financials unedited. If you bore me, you're out in 5 minutes. If you interest me—" She let the sentence trail off, the possibilities hanging unspoken. She turned to walk away, the golden gown swirling around her legs, photographer's flashes creating a strobe effect that turned her movement into something cinematic. "Wait." Christopher's voice came out more desperate than he'd intended. Amanda paused, looked back over her shoulder. The lighting from the chandelier caught the angle of her jaw, and for a split second Christopher saw something in her profile that triggered a cascade of fragmented memories. The curve of a cheek, the particular way light fell across high cheekbones, something from a long time ago, someone from— But then she smiled, and it was a predator's expression, all teeth and no warmth, and the moment of familiarity shattered. Have we met before?" The question sounded stupid even as he asked it, but Christopher couldn't shake the feeling. "You look incredibly familiar." Amanda's eyes glinted with something that might have been amusement or might have been something far more dangerous. "I have one of those faces, Mr. Hernandez. The kind you never forget once it's too late to do anything about it." Then she was gone, disappeared into the crowd that closed around her like water, leaving Christopher standing alone, feeling like he'd just invited something dangerous into his life and signed a contract he didn't fully understand. Rebecca appeared at his elbow, having finally looked up from her phone. "Was that Amanda Whitmore? Please tell me you didn't embarrass us." Christopher was still staring at the spot where Amanda had vanished. "I got a meeting. Tomorrow morning, 9 a.m. Rebecca actually looked at him for the first time all evening, something like genuine interest flickering in her dead eyes. "With the Whitmore woman, Christopher, that's actually good. Don't screw it up. We need her money." Christopher nodded, but his mind was elsewhere, running through mental files, trying to figure out why Amanda Whitmore's eyes had looked so familiar, why her profile had triggered something in his memory that felt important but stayed frustratingly just out of reach. Those eyes. Where had he seen those exact eyes before? The Plaza Hotel penthouse suite had been converted into something between a boardroom and a fortress. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked Central Park, the trees bare and skeletal in the November morning light. A glass desk sat in the center of the main room, modern and intimidating, deliberately positioned so whoever sat behind it would be backlit by the windows, creating a silhouette effect that put visitors at a psychological disadvantage. Two leather chairs faced the desk. A laptop sat closed on the glass surface. A projector screen had been mounted on one wall. Coffee service in silver waited untouched, the kind of detail that suggested wealth so complete that even the amenities were performative. Christopher arrived at 8:45, a full 15 minutes early, which was unprecedented in his adult life. Desperation had a way of changing behavior patterns. He carried a leather portfolio with scuffed corners because he couldn't afford a new one. The flash drive with his Titan presentation felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds in his jacket pocket. He'd rehearsed the pitch 47 times in his bathroom mirror at 3 in the morning because sleep had become impossible. The bags under his eyes were evidence of that insomnia, only partially concealed by concealer Rebecca had left in the bathroom. The doorman escorted him up to the penthouse. The door opened not to reveal Amanda, but Kenneth Clark, impeccable in his three-piece suit, looking at Christopher with an expression that managed to be both polite and utterly dismissive. "Mr. Hernandez, Ms. Whitmore is reviewing documents in her office. She'll be with you momentarily. Please have a seat." Christopher sat in the guest chair, which he immediately realized was positioned lower than the chair behind the desk, a classic power move he recognized but couldn't do anything about. Kenneth disappeared through a side door. 5 minutes passed. Then 10. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the ticking of an antique clock on the mantel that probably cost more than Christopher's car. Amanda was making him wait deliberately, letting the discomfort build, establishing dominance through absence. At exactly 9 a.m., the office door opened. Amanda entered, and she looked nothing like the golden goddess from the gala. Black Armani pantsuit, severe and professional, tailored to within a millimeter of perfection, hair pulled back in a tight bun. Reading glasses that she absolutely didn't need for vision, but that made her look like a professor about to fail a student. No jewelry, except Richard Whitmore's signet ring on her right hand. All business, no warmth. She walked to the desk without looking at Christopher, still reading from a document in her hand. She sat down, arranged the papers with precise movements, and only then acknowledged his presence. "Sit." The command was delivered without looking up. Christopher was already sitting, but somehow the order made him sink lower in the chair involuntarily, his body responding to the authority in her voice before his conscious mind could object. "Miss Whitmore, thank you for—" She cut him off with a raised hand, still not looking at him. "I don't care about the technology, Mr. Hernandez. I don't care about your artificial intelligence platform or your machine learning algorithms or whatever buzzwords you've prepared to dazzle me with. I care about the debt." She slid a folder across the glass desk. Christopher opened it with hands that had started to shake slightly. His stomach dropped through the floor. Deutsche Bank loan documents. $84 million personally guaranteed by Christopher Hernandez with covenants he was currently violating. J.P. Morgan, mezzanine financing. $120 million with Hernandez Technologies headquarters as collateral. Vandermeer Bank line of credit. $76 million cross-collateralized with every personal asset he owned. Every single document bore the same stamp in red ink. Purchased by Whitmore Maritime Holdings. The words refused to make sense. Christopher read them 3 times, his brain rejecting the information because accepting it meant accepting that he was already checkmated before the game had even begun. "Excuse me." His voice came out strangled. Amanda finally looked up, removing her reading glasses with theatrical precision. "I bought your debt, Christopher." The use of his first name felt like an invasion, intimate and possessive in a way that made his skin crawl. "The loans you took from Deutsche Bank to finance your merger with Rebecca mine now. The mezzanine financing from J.P. Morgan that you used to build your New Jersey facility, also mine. The revolving line of credit from Vandermeer that's been keeping your payroll funded for the past 6 months. Mine." She checked the Patek Philippe Calatrava on her wrist. $91,000 of Swiss precision. As of 9 a.m. this morning, Whitmore Maritime Holdings controls 60% of Hernandez Technologies' total liabilities. Christopher stood up so fast his chair screeched against the hardwood floor. That's hostile. That's a hostile action. Amanda remained seated, utterly calm, the picture of someone who'd expected this exact reaction. It's business, and you're in default on 2 of these covenants. Debt to EBITDA ratio exceeded maximum threshold. Interest coverage ratio below minimum requirement. I could foreclose on your headquarters today. I could force liquidation by end of business Friday. I could put 1,200 employees on the street by Thanksgiving. No. Christopher's mind raced through options, finding none that led anywhere good. The board would never allow Rebecca's father would. Amanda leaned back in her chair, steepled her fingers in front of her face like a supervillain explaining the hero's impending doom. Rebecca can't help you. I had my team run a comprehensive background check on Ms. Sanchez. Her father cut her off 6 months ago after discovering she'd been embezzling from the family trust to cover gambling debts. She's broke Christopher. Whatever control you thought she had over capital gone. You're drowning, and the person you thought was holding the life preserver is drowning right next to you. Christopher slumped back into the chair, the fight draining out of him as the full scope of the trap became clear. The walls of the suite seemed to be closing and the luxury turning claustrophobic. What do you want? The question came out defeated, barely above a whisper. Amanda leaned forward, predator-scenting blood. I want a seat on your board of directors with full voting rights. I want 51% equity stake in Project Titan, your artificial intelligence division. Controlling interest. And I want complete transparency on all financial decisions going forward. Every purchase order over $5,000 gets my approval. Every hire, every contract, every strategic decision runs through me. That project is my baby. Christopher's voice cracked on the word. It's the only thing I have left that's mine. Amanda's expression showed no sympathy whatsoever. Then you should have taken better care of it. You should have watched your expenses. You should have caught Rebecca's embezzlement before it cost you $4 million. You should have built a sustainable business instead of a house of cards held together with debt and optimistic projections. The door to the adjoining room burst open suddenly. Cartoon sounds spilled out, the Bluey theme song playing at high volume. A child's laughter. Emily ran into the room wearing pink pajamas with unicorns on them, clutching a stuffed elephant that had clearly been loved into submission. Mommy Ryan hit me with a pillow. Christopher's brain short-circuited. The word mommy combined with Amanda Whitmore created a dissonance his mind couldn't process. Children. The word came out strangled. You have children? Amanda's face transformed instantly, the Ice Queen melting into something softer, warmer, fundamentally human. The transformation was so complete, it was almost disturbing, like watching someone remove a mask to reveal a completely different person underneath. Yes, sweetheart. I'll handle it in just a moment. Go back to your brothers. Emily noticed Christopher for the first time, studied him with the unself-conscious directness of a 5-year-old who hadn't yet learned that staring was rude. Who's that man? A business associate. Say good morning, please. Emily performed a small curtsy with perfect British boarding school manners. Good morning, sir. Christopher couldn't speak. He could only stare at the child, at her dark hair and hazel eyes, and the way she carried herself with confidence far beyond her years. Emily cocked her head, still studying him with unsettling intensity. He looks sad. Is he a sad businessman, Mommy? Amanda suppressed what might have been a smile. Very sad, darling. Now run along. Emily waved with a small hand and disappeared back through the door, the cartoon sounds cutting off as it closed behind her. Christopher's mind was spinning through calculations that didn't add up. Triplets. Amanda's mask was back in place, all business again, as if the moment of maternal warmth had never happened. Yes, 5 years old. 5 years old. The number ricocheted around Christopher's skull like a bullet. Triplets. 5 years old. The same age his children with Sarah would be if... But that was impossible. Sarah was gone. Disappeared. The lawyers had tried to serve her with custody modification papers 2 years ago and come back empty-handed. She'd vanished completely, probably remarried someone in another state, probably living in some lower middle-class suburb somewhere, raising the children in the kind of mediocrity Christopher had worked his entire life to escape. Where is their father? The question came out before Christopher could stop it, driven by something he couldn't quite name. Amanda's smile turned dangerous. Not in the picture. He made his choices. My ex-wife, Christopher heard himself saying, his mouth disconnected from his brain. She had triplets 5 years ago. I haven't spoken to her since the day they were born. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Amanda's eyes went from cool to absolutely glacial. You abandoned them. It wasn't quite a question, more like a judge delivering a verdict. It was complicated. Christopher's throat was tight, defensive. I had to make choices. For the business, for the future. I couldn't. Amanda stood up, and the movement was so sudden and powerful that Christopher actually flinched. She walked around the desk and loomed over him, and somehow, despite being 5'7" to his 6'1", she seemed to tower. And look where those choices brought you, Mr. Hernandez. Sitting in a stranger's hotel suite begging for money to save a company you ran into the ground. Married to a woman who despises you. Drowning in debt you can't pay. Those were excellent choices. Truly masterful business strategy. Her sarcasm was a scalpel, precise and cutting. She returned to her position behind the desk, the power differential reestablished. I'll give you a lifeline. One chance to save yourself. But it comes with non-negotiable conditions. I want a tour of your facilities, all of them. Starting with the old R&D laboratory in Brooklyn, the one on Gowanus Canal. Tomorrow. Noon. Come alone. Christopher frowned, confusion cutting through his panic. We shut that facility down 4 years ago. It's just a storage space now. There's nothing there except old equipment we couldn't sell. Why would you possibly want... I have my reasons. Amanda's tone made it clear the discussion was over. Meet me there tomorrow, noon precisely. Don't be late. And Mr. Hernandez. Yes. Bring your curiosity. You're going to need it. Christopher left the plaza feeling like he'd survived a natural disaster, shaky and disoriented. As Kenneth escorted him to the elevator, Christopher caught his reflection in a hallway mirror. He looked pale, haunted, like he'd just signed a contract with something that wore a human face but wasn't quite human underneath. He couldn't shake the feeling that he'd just agreed to something far more significant than a business meeting. That evening, Christopher paced his Tribeca loft while Rebecca scrolled through her phone on the leather couch, ignoring him with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd elevated indifference to an art form. The loft was modern but cold, barely furnished, because they'd sold most of the furniture 8 months ago when the creditors had started calling more frequently. What remained had the impersonal quality of a hotel room, no warmth or personality, just expensive objects arranged in tasteful configurations. I met with Amanda Whitmore today. Christopher's voice sounded strange in the empty space. Rebecca didn't look up from her phone. And she owns our debt. All of it. Every major loan we've taken in the past 3 years. She could foreclose tomorrow if she wanted to. That got Rebecca's attention. She finally looked up, her Botoxed forehead trying and failing to furrow. So she's hostile. What does she want? Control of Titan? Board seat? Complete transparency on financials. Christopher paused, then added the part that had been bothering him all afternoon. But that's not the strange part. She has children. Triplets. 5 years old. Rebecca actually laughed, the sound harsh and brittle. So half the women in Manhattan have children, Christopher. Are you having some kind of breakdown? Should I be concerned about your mental state? Christopher pulled out the object he'd taken from Amanda's suite while Emily was running out of the room. A juice box. Apple and Eve brand organic, the kind that costs 3 times what normal juice boxes cost. Emily had left it on the coffee table and Christopher had grabbed it in a moment of impulse he still didn't fully understand. I took this from her suite. Rebecca stared at him like he'd lost his mind completely. You stole a juice box. A juice box. Have you completely lost your... I need to run a DNA test. The silence that followed was profound. Rebecca set down her phone with deliberate care. You think Amanda Whitmore is your ex-wife, the waitress, the orphan from Queens, the woman you divorced in a hospital room. Sarah had triplets 5 years ago, the same age as Christopher. Rebecca's voice took on the tone of someone explaining basic mathematics to a particularly stupid child. Amanda Whitmore owns half of London. She went to Oxford. She speaks 4 languages fluently. She has a British accent that screams old money education. She's worth $14 billion. Your ex-wife was a nobody, a waitress who couldn't afford community college. They are not the same person. You're being paranoid and delusional, and honestly, it's embarrassing. But Christopher couldn't let it go. Just let me check. Please, I need to know. Rebecca shrugged, already losing interest. Fine. Waste money on your paranoid fantasy. But when this investor deal falls through because you're acting insane, I'm done. I'll file for divorce myself, and you can drown alone. The Gene Direct Lab on 47th Street specialized in discreet DNA testing for wealthy clients who had reasons to keep their paternity questions private. The office was unmarked the entrance through a jewelry store that served as a front. The technician wore a white coat and the expression of someone who'd stopped being surprised by anything years ago. Rush paternity test with same-day results. That's $5,000 extra for expedited processing. Christopher pulled out his credit card, the one that was already dangerously close to its limit, and handed it over without hesitation. I need results by tomorrow morning, 7 a.m. latest. The technician swabbed the inside of Christopher's cheek with professional efficiency, then opened the juice box and swabbed the rim where a child's mouth would have been. We should have results by 6 a.m. I'll email them to the address on file. Christopher left the lab and walked through Manhattan's streets that had turned cold and hostile. It was 11 p.m. The city moved around him, indifferent to his crisis people going about their lives, while his world teetered on the edge of collapse. He found himself standing outside Romano's diner, the place where Sarah had worked for years, where he used to pick her up after her double shifts. It had closed 2 years ago, a victim of rising rents and changing neighborhoods. The windows were papered over with notices about the space being available for lease. Christopher looked at his reflection in the dark glass. Who was he? What had he become? He'd traded Sarah for Rebecca, stability for status, a woman who'd loved him for a woman who despised him. He'd abandoned his children for a merger that was failing. He'd sacrificed everything real for things that turned out to be worthless. His phone buzzed with an email notification. Gene Direct Labs processing sample, results available. 6 a.m. November 18th. 12 hours until he knew the truth. 12 hours until everything either made sense or he confirmed he was losing his mind. The abandoned R&D warehouse on Gowanus Canal looked like something from a post-apocalyptic film. The metal door hung crooked on its hinges, rust bleeding down the gray paint like old blood. When Christopher pushed it open, it shrieked loud enough to scatter pigeons roosting in the rafters. Inside, dust motes danced in shafts of light that cut through grime-coated windows. Covered workbenches lined the walls. Old server racks, stripped of their valuable components, stood like metal skeletons. Graffiti covered the concrete walls, tags and symbols, and the occasional piece of actual art. The smell was rust and old electronics and pigeon droppings and memories. Christopher stood in the center of the space and felt time collapse. This was where it had started. Before the skyscrapers and the billions and the expensive suits. 2014. He was 25. Sarah was 23, and they were young and hungry and stupid enough to believe they could change the world with nothing but ambition and salvaged equipment. He could see Sarah's ghost everywhere. Over there by the window, wearing his oversized NYU sweatshirt that hung to her knees, grease smudged across her cheek, soldering a circuit board with her tongue caught between her teeth in concentration. The way she'd looked up at him and smiled, that genuine smile that had made him believe anything was possible. "We're going to change the world, Chris." Her voice echoed in his memory so clear he could almost believe she was actually there. "Nostalgic, isn't it?" The voice came from the shadows, and Christopher spun around. Amanda Whitmore stood by the old server rack where they'd mounted their first successful prototype. But she wasn't wearing a power suit or designer gown. Faded jeans that somehow looked expensive despite their casual appearance. Simple white silk blouse, hair down falling in loose waves instead of pulled back in that severe bun, no jewelry except the signet ring. She looked younger, softer, more human. She looked like her. "Why did you bring me here?" Christopher's voice echoed in the empty warehouse. Amanda walked toward him slowly, her footsteps clicking on the concrete floor. "To see if you remembered. This is where you told me we were partners, that it was us against the world, that you and I were going to build something that mattered more than money. Do you remember saying those things?" Christopher frowned. "I told my ex-wife that, not you. I've never met you before the gala." Amanda stopped 10 feet away from him. The air between them felt charged electric like the moment before lightning strikes. "Christopher." Her voice dropped, the British accent sliding away like a mask being removed, replaced by something warmer, more familiar. The Queen's accent she'd spent 5 years erasing came back like muscle memory. "Look at me. Really look at me." Christopher stared. His eyes traced the curve of her jaw, the particular way her eyes crinkled slightly at the corners when she was thinking hard about something, the birthmark on her left shoulder visible through the sheer fabric of her blouse, the small scar above her right eyebrow from a childhood fall she'd told him about years ago while they were lying in bed in their first apartment. His phone buzzed in his pocket. The notification made his hand shake as he pulled out the device. Gene Direct Labs. DNA. Test results available. He opened the email with fingers that had gone numb. DNA. Paternity test results. Sample A. Christopher Hernandez versus Sample B. Unknown child. Female match. 99.97%. Conclusion. Sample A is biological father of child from Sample B, with greater than 99% certainty. The phone showed 3 separate results, each one identical except for the gender markers. Child 1 male, Jacob, 99.97%. Child 2 male, Ryan, 99.98%. Child 3 female, Emily, 99%. The warehouse tilted. Christopher's vision tunneled to a single point. His knees buckled and he had to grab the edge of a workbench to stay upright. "Sarah." The name came out as a whisper, the syllables feeling like broken glass in his throat. Amanda didn't flinch, didn't deny, just stood there watching him with eyes that were no longer soft or warm or anything resembling the love she'd once felt. Just judgment, cold, absolute judgment. "You thought I died, or disappeared, or just didn't matter enough to find." She wasn't asking questions, she was stating facts. "The lawyers said you vanished. They couldn't serve you. They searched for months and—" "I did die." Amanda's voice was surgical steel wrapped in silk. "Sarah Rodriguez died in a basement apartment in the Bronx 3 weeks after you walked out of that hospital room. She died when you told her children were baggage. She died when you chose money over family." She took a step closer and Christopher took a step back, the predator-prey dynamic clear and inevitable. Amanda Whitmore rose from her ashes. Whitmore. Christopher's brain was struggling to process connections forming too slowly. The shipping empire, the 14 billion. That's you. Amanda's smile was absolutely merciless. "My mother was Catherine Whitmore, Richard Whitmore's only daughter. I didn't know until 3 weeks after you threw me away like garbage. Isn't that funny fate has such an incredible sense of humor, Chris?" She spat his old nickname like it was poisonous. "You divorced a penniless waitress to marry a millionaire, only to find out the waitress was actually a billionaire all along. The woman you abandoned in a hospital bed with 3 premature babies who might have died without proper care. She inherited more money than you'll ever see in 100 lifetimes." The cosmic irony of it was suffocating. If Christopher had just stayed, if he'd waited 3 weeks, if he'd shown even a shred of basic human decency, he would be married to the richest woman in London. He'd be the father of the Whitmore heirs. He'd have everything he'd ever wanted without having to destroy his soul to get it. Instead, "I didn't know." The words came out pathetic, pleading. "Sarah, you have to understand. The pressure I was under. The company was failing. Rebecca promised her father would inject capital. I thought I was making a strategic decision for our future. Don't." Amanda's voice rose for the first time, fury breaking through the ice like lava through a glacier. Don't you dare try to rewrite history. You didn't do it for strategy. You did it for your ego. You wanted the shiny new toy. You wanted Rebecca's name and her father's connections and a trophy wife who looked good in the society pages. You left me to rot in a basement. You left your children to starve. I gave you 50,000. Amanda's laugh was harsh and bitter, the sound of something that had learned cruelty as a survival skill. Do you know how much the NICU bills were? Christopher, $187,000. For 3 premature infants over 18 days. If I hadn't inherited my grandfather's estate 21 days after you walked out, we would have been on the street. Jacob Ryan. Emily, your children would have been homeless because of you. Because you couldn't be bothered to pay for the medical care your own babies needed to survive. Each word landed like a physical blow. Christopher felt them accumulating, bruises forming on top of bruises until he could barely breathe under the weight. I want to see them. The possessiveness surged up from somewhere primal male ego and ownership. They're my children. I have rights. Amanda pulled a folded document from her bag and threw it at his feet. He recognized it immediately. The divorce decree. You signed your rights away. Full custody to mother. Termination of all parental rights and obligations. You wanted a clean break. You got one. I'll sue. The threat was empty, and they both knew it. I'll tell the world who you are. I'll expose. Go ahead. Amanda shrugged with practiced indifference. Tell them. Tell the press that you divorced the Whitmore heiress 3 minutes after she gave birth. Tell them you abandoned Triplets. Tell them you called your own children baggage. The media will eat you alive, Christopher. Hernandez Technologies stock is already trading at junk status. One scandal like this and you're delisted, bankrupt, unemployable. You'll never work in tech again. Christopher fell to his knees. The concrete was cold and hard, and exactly what he deserved. The warehouse around him, this place where they'd been happy, where they'd built something real together, felt like a tomb. What do you want? His voice was hoarse, defeated. You bought my debt. You own my company. You have all the power. Is this about humiliation? Public revenge? Do you want to destroy me completely? Amanda knelt down so they were eye level, her face inches from his. I want you to feel what I felt. Helpless. Discarded. Powerless. I want you to know what it's like to lose everything you built because someone decided you weren't enough. In that moment, Christopher Hernandez understood something he'd never grasped before, that the real cost of his ambition wasn't measured in dollars or stock prices or market capitalization. It was measured in the faces of 3 children who would never know their father. And that loss, that irreversible, devastating loss, was worth more than every penny he'd ever made or ever would make. The metal doors banged open with a crash that made both of them jump. Rebecca stormed in her Louboutins, sinking into the dust and debris, her face twisted with fury that made her Botox crack around the edges. Christopher, you coward! The boardroom on the 50th floor of Hernandez Technologies had always been Christopher's sanctuary, his cathedral of glass and steel designed to intimidate anyone who dared negotiate with him. But on the morning of November 19, 2024, at exactly 9 o'clock, the room felt different. The air was thinner, sharper, like the atmosphere at high altitude where breathing required conscious effort. The mahogany table Christopher had imported from Italy for a sum that would have fed a family for years now felt like an executioner's block. The company logo, a silver H enclosed in a circle that was supposed to represent innovation and integrity, had already been removed from the wall behind the head of the table. In its place, a blank white space screamed erasure. Christopher sat at the far end, the seat usually reserved for junior associates or desperate vendors pitching products nobody wanted. His hands were folded in his lap to hide their trembling. Next to him, Rebecca tapped her foot with aggressive rhythm, her face a mask of indignation that was rapidly cracking to reveal terror underneath. At the head of the table sat Amanda Whitmore, and she didn't speak immediately. She let the silence stretch until it became suffocating, a tactical move Christopher recognized because he'd used it himself 1,000 times. Flanking her were Kenneth Clark and 4 forensic auditors who looked less like accountants and more like surgeons preparing for an amputation. This is ridiculous. Rebecca's voice shattered the quiet like glass breaking. "You can't just storm in here and hijack a board meeting. My father will destroy you for this. Sanchez Financial won't stand for— Sanchez Financial has already disavowed you, Rebecca." Amanda's voice was calm, melodic, terrifyingly final. She didn't even look up from the document in front of her. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. "Excuse me," Rebecca's voice cracked on the second word. "I spoke with Harrison Sanchez 20 minutes ago." Amanda finally raised her eyes, and they were hard as diamonds. "When I informed him of the forensic audit results regarding your spending habits, he made his position very clear. Protecting the family bank is more important than protecting a daughter who treats a publicly traded company as her personal ATM." Rebecca went pale, the expensive foundation she wore suddenly visible as a mask against bloodless skin. "Spending habits? I have an expense account. I'm the chief branding officer. My image is the company's image." Amanda signaled to the lead auditor, a severe woman with gray hair pulled back so tight it looked painful. The auditor pressed a key, and the large projection screen behind Amanda flickered to life. It wasn't a PowerPoint presentation about synergy or growth projections. It was a list meticulously detailed and damning in its precision. Project Azure, Shell Company, Cayman Islands, total embezzled, $4,270,000. The number appeared in red letters large enough to read from across the room. "Over the last 18 months, Amanda's voice was clinical, a doctor diagnosing a terminal disease. "You funneled $4.27 million of company funds through a shell company registered in your personal assistant's name." The auditor clicked to the next slide. A photograph of a yacht, sleek and expensive, cutting through impossibly blue water. The Lady Rebecca, registered in Monaco. $2.1 million billed to Hernandez Technologies as a maritime research vessel for Project Titan. Amanda's tone suggested how absurd she found this justification. Despite the fact that Project Titan is an artificial intelligence initiative with no maritime component whatsoever. Christopher turned his head slowly to look at his wife, and his face showed the exact moment realization detonated behind his eyes. "You told me the R&D budget dried up. You said we had to fire the engineering team because market conditions were tight." Rebecca refused to meet his gaze, her jaw clenched so hard the muscles jumped. The slides continued, each one more damning than the last. A Cartier diamond necklace for $380,000 billed as optical hardware. A week at the Four Seasons in Bora Bora for $95,000 classified as Pacific market research. Private jet charters totaling $1.7 million, all supposedly for client acquisition meetings that the auditors had verified never actually occurred. "This isn't high finance, Rebecca." Amanda leaned forward slightly, and the movement was predatory. "This is embezzlement, grand larceny, fraud that violates approximately 14 federal statutes and 6 state laws." She closed the folder with a heavy thud that echoed in the silent boardroom. "The Securities and Exchange Commission has been notified, so has the Manhattan District Attorney's Office. The police are waiting in the lobby with an arrest warrant. We allowed you to come up here as a courtesy to surrender your badge and your dignity in private, rather than being perp-walked through the building in handcuffs." Rebecca stood so fast her chair toppled backward, the crash impossibly loud in the carpeted room. "You're lying. You're just a jealous, bitter ex-wife trying to ruin me because Christopher chose someone better." "I don't have to try." Amanda's voice was soft, almost gentle, which somehow made it worse. "You did all the work yourself." Rebecca grabbed Christopher's arm, her nails digging into his suit jacket hard enough that he flinched. "Do something. You're the CEO. Call security. Kick her out. She can't just take everything we built." Christopher looked at the hand clutching his arm at the perfectly manicured nails painted the exact shade of red that Rebecca's stylist had said projected confidence and power. He looked at the woman he'd destroyed his life for, the woman who'd promised to save his company and his reputation, the woman who'd made him feel like he was finally playing in the big leagues. Then he gently, deliberately peeled her fingers off his jacket. "I can't help you, Rebecca." His voice was hoarse, scraped raw. "I don't have the authority. I'm not the CEO anymore." Rebecca recoiled like he'd slapped her, stumbling backward. "You coward! You spineless, pathetic excuse for a man! I should have never married you. You were nothing when I met you, and you're nothing now." On that point, Amanda's voice cut through the vitriol like a scalpel. "We can all agree. Now get out." The doors opened on cue and two uniformed security guards stepped inside. Not the Hernandez Technologies security team, these were NYPD officers with badges and everything that came with them. Rebecca screamed insults as they escorted her out, her voice echoing down the hallway until the elevator doors dinged shut and silence rushed back like water filling a vacuum. Then there were two. Christopher sat alone at the end of the long table, feeling microscopic. Amanda remained at the head, perfectly composed, and between them stretched an expanse of polished wood that might as well have been an ocean. "Are you going to send me to jail too?" Christopher's question came out barely above a whisper. Amanda stood and walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked Manhattan. The city sprawled beneath them, indifferent to the drama playing out 50 stories above the street. "The audit shows you were negligent, Christopher, not criminal. You signed off on budgets without reviewing the line items. Classic absentee CEO syndrome. You trusted the wrong person, gave her access to everything, and didn't bother to verify what she was doing with it." She turned to face him, backlit by the November sun. "You didn't steal the money. You just let someone else steal it because you were too busy looking at your own reflection to check the books." The words were measured, precise, designed to cut without being cruel. "You're stripped of your equity. The board voted this morning to seize your shares to cover the liquidity crisis caused by Rebecca's embezzlement. You're bankrupt, Christopher. The penthouse in Tribeca is company property. You have 48 hours to vacate. Your personal accounts have been frozen pending the completion of the federal investigation. As of 9:15 this morning, you have less than nothing." Christopher closed his eyes. It was absolute ruin, total obliteration. At 35 years old, he'd just lost everything he'd spent a decade building. "I understand." He stood up, his legs feeling like they might not support him. "I'll start packing." "Sit down." It wasn't a shout, but the authority in Amanda's voice made his knees buckle involuntarily. He sat. Amanda walked back to the table and slid a single document across the polished surface. It stopped directly in front of him. "Employment agreement. Junior engineer. Hernandez Technologies. Whitmore Maritime subsidiary." Christopher stared at the paper like it might be a trap, some elaborate humiliation designed to break whatever was left of him. "What is this? A job offer?" Amanda's tone was business-like, professional. "Hernandez Technologies, now a subsidiary of Whitmore Maritime Holdings, needs personnel for the R&D division, specifically for Project Titan. You know the code better than anyone because you wrote most of it before you became too important to actually do real work." Christopher's heart did something complicated in his chest, hope and humiliation fighting for dominance. "You want me to run the department? I want you to work in the department." The correction was gentle but firm. "Read the terms." Christopher picked up the document with shaking hands and scanned the details printed in crisp legal text. Salary $78,000 per annum. Office location annex, B basement level. Reports to Chief Technology Officer, no voting rights, no stock options, no executive privileges. He read the salary line 3 times, certain he'd misread it. $78,000 a year. His voice was hollow. "I was the CEO. I built this company from nothing. You want me to work in the basement for less than I used to spend on watches. I want you to learn what it means to earn your keep." Amanda leaned over the table, and for the first time since she'd revealed herself in Brooklyn, her voice carried genuine emotion instead of calculated ice. "You wanted shortcuts, Christopher. You wanted the penthouse and the trophy wife and the respect without doing the actual work to deserve any of it. Well, the shortcut led you off a cliff. Now I'm offering you the stairs. It's a long climb back up, and there's no guarantee you'll make it. Do you have the stomach for it?" Christopher looked at the contract, at the terms that would reduce him from master of the universe to anonymous cog in a machine. It was insulting, degrading, the kind of fall that would make him the subject of whispered gossip at every industry event for the next decade. It was also the only option he had besides homelessness. Why? The question tore itself from somewhere deep in his chest. After everything I did to you, after I threw you away like garbage, why give me anything at all?" Amanda's face softened for exactly 3 seconds, a crack in the armor that closed almost immediately. "Because of Jacob, and Ryan, and Emily." The names of his children, children he'd never met, never held, never even looked at in their bassinets, landed like physical blows. Christopher felt tears prick his eyes, hot and shameful and impossible to stop. "Do they—" his voice broke. "Do they know about me? Can I see them? They know they have a father. They know he was brilliant once before he got lost." Amanda's voice was quiet, but every word was deliberate. "But they don't know you, Christopher. Not this version of you. Not the man who valued a merger over his own children." She walked around the table until she stood directly beside him, close enough that he could smell her perfume. Jasmine, and something darker. Nothing like the drugstore body spray Sarah used to wear. "You don't get to buy your way into their lives. You don't get to show up and be dad just because you share some DNA. You have to earn it. You have to become a man worthy of them." Christopher's throat was so tight he could barely breathe. "How? Tell me how to do that." Amanda placed a cheap plastic pen on top of the contract. It was the kind of pen you got free from banks. Nothing like the Mont Blanc he'd shoved in Sarah's hand in the hospital. "Sign the paper. Go down to the basement. Do the work. Be humble. Pay your rent. Fix the mess you made of this company. And maybe in a year, if you're still here, if you haven't quit because your ego couldn't handle being nobody special, I'll invite you to a soccer game. As a friend. As someone they might want to know." The choice crystallized in front of him with brutal clarity. He could walk out that door and disappear into whatever life awaited bankrupted CEOs with no skills except failed leadership. Or he could pick up that cheap plastic pen and sign away every shred of pride he had left. Christopher picked up the pen. His hand shook so badly he could barely control it, but his resolve was solidifying into something that felt almost like strength. "I'm sorry, Sarah." The name came out naturally the first time he'd used it in 5 years. For everything. For all of it. "Don't tell me." Amanda turned toward the door. "Show me." Christopher pressed pen to paper and signed his name, Christopher Hernandez. He set the pen down carefully like it was something precious instead of worthless plastic. He wasn't an emperor anymore. Wasn't a genius CEO or a visionary or anything special at all. He was an employee. A junior engineer making $78,000 a year with a cubicle in the basement. And for the first time in 5 years, as he looked at his signature on that humiliating contract, he didn't feel like a fraud. "Mr. Clark will show you to your desk." Amanda didn't look back as she walked toward the executive suite that had been Christopher's office until this morning. "Don't be late tomorrow, Mr. Hernandez. We have a lot of work to do." The basement level of Hernandez Technologies' officially designated Annex B on the building directory was everything the executive floors weren't. Fluorescent lights that buzzed with electrical complaint. Concrete walls painted industrial beige. 8 cubicles with outdated computers and chairs that had seen better decades. The smell of burnt coffee and electronic components, and faintly the musty scent of a ventilation system that needed upgrading. Christopher descended the stairs at 7:45 the next morning, carrying a cardboard box with the few personal items he'd been allowed to retrieve from his penthouse before the locks were changed. A photograph of his parents, both dead now. A coffee mug from his Wharton graduation. A small trophy from a hackathon he'd won 15 years ago, back when he still wrote code instead of managing people who wrote code. Derek Chen was waiting at the bottom of the stairs. Chief Technology Officer, 43 years old, perpetually tired eyes behind thick-framed glasses. He'd been with Hernandez Technologies since the early days, back when the whole company was 12 people working out of the Brooklyn warehouse. "You're Blake. I'm Chen. Your boss. You're late." Christopher checked his watch reflexively. "It's 7:58. I'm early. We start at 7:30. Don't let it happen again." Derek turned and walked toward the cubicles without waiting to see if Christopher followed. Christopher did his expensive shoes, the last pair he owned after selling everything else to pay lawyers, clicking on the concrete floor. "Your assignment." Derek stopped at the smallest cubicle, the one positioned directly next to a server rack that hummed so loudly conversation required raised voices. Debug the neural network training pipeline for Project Titan. Last guy couldn't crack it. You have 2 weeks. Questions. Christopher swallowed his pride, which tasted like ashes and battery acid. No, sir. Derek's expression flickered with something that might have been surprise or might have been nothing at all. Good. Get to work. He walked away, leaving Christopher alone in a cubicle that was roughly the size of a closet. The computer was at least 3 years old. The monitor had a dead pixel in the upper right corner, and the chair squeaked every time he shifted his weight. Christopher opened his laptop, his personal one, not the company-issued machine that had been confiscated during the audit, and logged into the Project Titan codebase. What he found made his stomach turn. This was his architecture. His original design from 5 years ago, back when he'd still been hands-on with development. But it had been corrupted, mutilated by budget cuts and incompetent modifications, broken pipelines, missing modules, sloppy patches that barely held together. This was what happened when you stopped paying attention to the actual work and started caring only about stock prices and merger deals and impressing people who didn't matter. This is what I became, he muttered to no one. This disaster is what happens when the CEO stops being an engineer. He dove into the code with a focus he hadn't felt in years, forgetting about lunch, forgetting about everything except the problem in front of him. At 9 o'clock that night, Derek stopped by the cubicle and found Christopher still there, surrounded by empty coffee cups and scribbled notes. Still here. Christopher looked up, surprised by how much time had passed. I'm close to solving the training bottleneck. The original architecture is sound, but someone implemented the backpropagation wrong. If I can just, don't burn out first week. Derek's voice was softer than it had been that morning. Go home. I don't have a home. The words came out before Christopher could stop them. I have a sublet studio in Queens that smells like the restaurant downstairs. He gestured at the cubicle at the code on his screen. This is all I have. Derek studied him for a long moment, and something in his expression shifted. Then make it count. He walked away, leaving Christopher alone with the hum of servers and the glow of his monitor and the first genuine sense of purpose he'd felt since the hospital. 3 months passed in a blur of code and coffee and slow, painful rebuilding. The solution to the training bottleneck came in February in the middle of the night during one of the many sessions where Christopher stayed until security kicked him out. The neural network achieved 94% accuracy on the validation set, well above the industry standard of 87%. It was breakthrough-level work, the kind of innovation that could actually save the company. Derek called him into a conference room the next morning. The other engineers were there, 5 people who'd barely spoken to Christopher in 3 months beyond necessary work communication. Your solution works. Derek's voice was neutral, but his eyes showed something different. We ran tests all night. This is the kind of work I hired you hoping you'd do. Christopher felt heat rise in his face, a flush of pride that he hadn't earned through politics or networking or anything except actual competence. It's what I was hired for. I'm just doing my job. No. Derek shook his head. You were hired to debug. You revolutionized. I'm recommending you for promotion to senior engineer, effective immediately. Includes a pay increase to $95,000 and a move to the 3rd floor. The words should have felt like victory, but Christopher found himself hesitating. There's a condition, isn't there? Derek's expression confirmed it. She wants to see you, tomorrow, her office. The she in question needed no clarification. Amanda's executive office occupied the entire northwest corner of the 50th floor with windows on 2 sides offering views of Manhattan that would have cost millions if they were residential. The furniture was minimalist, expensive, chosen to convey power without ostentation. A glass desk that somehow managed to look both delicate and indestructible. 2 chairs across from it positioned to make visitors feel slightly uncomfortable. Christopher stood when the assistant showed him in his cheap suit, the best he could afford on $78,000 a year, making him feel even more out of place than usual. Amanda didn't stand. She sat behind the desk reviewing documents, letting him wait. The tactic was familiar because he'd used it himself countless times. Now, experiencing it from the other side, he understood how deliberately cruel it was. "Derek tells me you solved the Titan bottleneck." She finally looked up and her face was unreadable. "Congratulations." "It was a team effort." The words came automatically, the kind of false modesty that executives were supposed to display. The old Christopher would have taken all the credit. A small smile touched her lips, gone almost immediately. "Maybe you're learning." She leaned back in her chair and the movement was all predator, all calculated power. "Why are you still here, Christopher, 3 months in a basement? $78,000 a year. No equity, no prestige, no future except grinding out code like you're 25 again. Most men with your ego would have quit after week 1. The question had weight, demanded honesty. "Because I have nowhere else to go." Christopher's voice was steady, surprising himself. "And because for the first time in years I'm building something real. Not an image, not a stock price, something that actually matters. The work matters. The work matters. But more than that." He paused, choosing words carefully. "The chance to prove I'm not the man who walked out of that hospital room. That I can be something better." Amanda's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. "Jacob asked about you last week." Christopher's heart stopped and restarted the pause between beats lasting an eternity. "What did he say?" "He said, 'Mommy, does our father know we exist?' I told him yes. He asked, 'Does he love us?'" She paused, and for the first time Christopher saw something vulnerable in her eyes. "I said I didn't know." Tears started falling before Christopher could stop them, hot tracks down his face that he didn't bother to wipe away. "I do. I love them. I loved them the moment I saw the DNA test. I was just too much of a coward to admit I'd thrown them away." The words hung between them, raw and painful, and completely true. Amanda opened a drawer and pulled out a single sheet of paper. She slid it across the glass desk. "I'm going to offer you something, but if you accept there are rules, non-negotiable." Christopher picked up the paper with shaking hands. It was simple, direct printed in Arial font, like it had been drafted in 5 minutes. "Visitation agreement, probationary. Saturday, Riverside Park, 2 p.m. The children have soccer practice." Amanda's voice was careful, controlled. "You can watch from the bleachers. You don't approach them. You don't speak to them. You just watch." Christopher couldn't speak, his throat too tight. "Every Saturday for a month. If you show up on time, if you sit quietly, if you respect the boundaries, then maybe, and I emphasize maybe, I'll introduce you. As Mommy's friend Christopher, baby steps." "Why are you doing this?" The question came out hoarse. "Why give me any chance at all?" Amanda was quiet for a long moment, her eyes distant. "Because Jacob was right when he said everybody makes mistakes, and because those children deserve a chance to know their father. Not the CEO. Not the failure. The man who's willing to earn his place in their lives." She stood and the meeting was clearly over. "Don't make me regret this, Christopher." The first Saturday arrived with the weight of Judgment Day. Christopher reached Riverside Park at 1:50 p.m., 10 minutes early, and his hands were shaking so badly he had to shove them in his pockets. The soccer field was busy with children in bright jerseys, parents on bleachers shouting encouragement, the smell of grass and hot dogs from a nearby vendor. He sat on the bleachers farthest from the field, wearing a baseball cap and sunglasses like a criminal trying to avoid recognition. At precisely 2 o'clock, Amanda arrived with 3 children in matching blue jerseys. Number 7. Number 12. Number 9. Jacob, Ryan, Emily. Christopher watched as they ran onto the field, and his entire world narrowed to 3 small figures who carried half his DNA and none of his history. Jacob was thoughtful, the kind of kid who thought 3 moves ahead. He didn't score, but he set up every goal with passes that showed strategic intelligence. Ryan was athletic, aggressive in the way good players were scoring twice in the first 10 minutes. Emily was fearless, defending against kids twice her size and refusing to back down from anything. They were perfect, absolutely perfect, and they had no idea he existed. Practice ended, and the children ran to Amanda, who'd been sitting on the opposite bleacher. Emily looked toward Christopher's position, her expression curious. "Mommy? Who's that man?" Amanda's voice carried across the field, calm and unbothered. "Just someone watching the game, sweetheart." Christopher stood to leave before he was noticed more than he already had been, but Jacob, perceptive, brilliant, Jacob stopped and stared directly at him. "He's been watching us, the whole time, just us, not any of the other kids." Amanda caught Christopher's eye across the field, and something passed between them. A question, an answer, permission. "Same time next week." Her voice was loud enough to carry. Christopher nodded, not trusting himself to speak. The second Saturday, he brought a notebook and sketched the children as they played, capturing movements and expressions and the way Emily laughed when she stole the ball. The third Saturday brought rain, and practice was canceled, but Christopher showed up anyway and sat in the rain for 30 minutes until Amanda texted him, "Go home, next week." The fourth Saturday, Amanda sat next to him on the bleachers for the first time in 3 months. They didn't speak for the first 10 minutes, just watched the children play. "They're incredible." Christopher's voice was rough with emotion. "You raised them well, without me. They ask about you." Amanda kept her eyes on the field. "Oliver Googled your name, found old articles, photos of us from before." Christopher felt his chest tighten. "What did you tell them?" "The truth, that you were brilliant and lost, and that you're trying to find your way back." "Am I?" The question was genuine. "Finding my way back." Amanda turned to look at him directly, and her expression was softer than he'd seen it since Brooklyn. "You've shown up every week, on time. You haven't pushed, you haven't demanded. You've just been here. That's more than I expected." Christopher wiped at his eyes, not caring anymore who saw him cry. "Can I meet them?" "Please, Amanda. I'm begging you." Amanda stood, brushed invisible grass from her expensive jeans. "Next week. Not as their father, as my friend Christopher. We'll see how it goes from there." The fifth Saturday came with the weight of everything Christopher had lost and everything he might still save. Practice ended, and this time Amanda called the children over. 3 small humans approached with curiosity and caution in equal measure, stopping a safe distance away. "Jacob, Ryan, Emily, I want you to meet someone." Amanda's voice was gentle but firm. "This is Christopher. He's an old friend of Mommy's." Christopher knelt to their level, which made him feel vulnerable and exposed and completely appropriate for the moment. "Hi," his voice cracked. "I've been watching you play. You're all really talented." Emily, suspicious and protective. "Why do you come every week?" Christopher looked at Amanda, who nodded almost imperceptibly. "Permission to be honest, within limits." "Because I love soccer, and because you 3 are the best players on the field." Jacob studied Christopher's face with uncomfortable intensity. "You look like Ryan. Same eyes." The observation landed like a punch. "I've been told that." Christopher's voice was barely steady. "Ryan direct in the way children were. Are you our father?" The question hung in the cold February air like a blade waiting to drop. Amanda knelt beside Christopher, put her hand on Emily's shoulder. "Yes, sweetheart. Christopher is your biological father." Emily took a step backward, and the movement cut deeper than any insult Rebecca had ever thrown. "You're the one who made Mommy cry." Christopher felt tears start falling and didn't try to stop them. "Yes, I did. And I'm sorrier than you can ever know." Jacob, the strategist, the thinker. "Do you want to be our dad?" Christopher looked at Amanda, then back at the 3 children who held his entire future in their small, perfect hands, more than anything in the world. "But I have to earn that. I have to prove I'm good enough." Emily considered this with 5-year-old seriousness. "How?" "By showing up, every week, by working hard, by being honest, by never, ever leaving again." Ryan stepped forward and extended his hand with the formality of someone who'd been taught proper manners. "Okay, you can start by shaking my hand. That's what good dads do." Christopher took Ryan's hand, then Jacob's, then Emily's, and felt something in his chest that had been frozen for 5 years finally begin to thaw. Deal. Emily, still suspicious but willing to negotiate. Do you know how to play soccer? I used to. It's been a while. Want to play with us? Just for a little bit? Christopher looked at Amanda, who nodded. They played for 20 minutes. Christopher awkward at first, but muscle memory returning, passing the ball with his children under a February sky that was starting to clear. Emily laughed when she stole the ball from him. Jacob set up a perfect shot that Christopher pretended to struggle to block. Ryan scored and celebrated like he'd won the World Cup. Amanda watched from the bleachers, and when Christopher glanced over, he saw her wipe tears from her eyes before turning away. 1 year later, on November 20th, 2025, the boardroom was packed with press and cameras and analysts waiting for the announcement that would reshape the tech industry. Project Titan had launched the previous month to universal acclaim. The AI platform was already being used by Fortune 500 companies, government agencies, research institutions. Hernandez Technologies now officially. Whitmore. Hernandez Technologies had seen its stock price increase 220% in 12 months. The company was valued at $8.2 billion, a spectacular resurrection from near death. Christopher stood at the presentation podium, no longer the CEO, but the Senior Vice President of Research and Development, and the title felt earned rather than inherited. He wore a suit he'd bought with his own money from his own paycheck, and it fit better than the Brioni had ever fit. A journalist from Bloomberg raised her hand. "Mr. Hernandez, how does it feel to work under your ex-wife's leadership?" The question was designed to embarrass, to draw blood, to create a soundbite. Christopher smiled. "It feels like I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be. Amanda Whitmore is the most brilliant CEO I've ever known. Working for her is an honor, not a punishment. I'm learning more now than I learned in 10 years of running this company into the ground." Amanda, sitting at the head of the table, allowed herself a small smile. After the press conference, after the analysts had left and the cameras had been packed away, Christopher and Amanda stood in her office, looking out at the Manhattan skyline. "The board wants to give you equity." Amanda's voice was measured. 2% of the company. That's worth approximately $164 million at current valuation. Christopher felt the number like a physical force, a gravitational pull toward a life he'd thought was gone forever. "That's..." He couldn't finish the sentence. "You've earned it. The work speaks for itself. Project Titan is successful because you rebuilt it from the ground up." Christopher was quiet for a long moment, thinking about the children who called him Dad now, about the Sunday dinners at Amanda's penthouse where he was allowed to help with homework, about the soccer games where he stood on the sidelines and cheered until his voice went hoarse. "I don't need it." The words came out clear and certain. "I have everything I need." Amanda turned to look at him directly. "Which is?" "Saturday soccer games, Sunday dinners where Emily lets me help with her math homework. The chance to be their father. That's worth more than any stock option." Something shifted in Amanda's expression, a wall coming down that he hadn't even known was there. "They love you, you know. Jacob told me last week, Christopher is the best dad ever." The words hit Christopher like lightning, like grace, like redemption he didn't deserve but had somehow been given anyway. "He called me Dad." His voice broke on the word. "He's been calling you Dad for months. Just not to your face. I think he's ready now. They all are." There was a knock on the office door, and before either of them could respond, it burst open. Jacob, Ryan, and Emily tumbled in, dressed up from the launch celebration, looking like miniature versions of wealthy Manhattan children. Emily ran straight to Christopher and wrapped her arms around his waist. "Dad, did you see us on TV? We were in the audience when you did the presentation." Christopher froze, looked at Amanda, who was smiling now without reservation. "It's okay," she mouthed. Christopher hugged Emily, then knelt to embrace all 3 children at once. "I saw you, sweetheart. You looked beautiful." Ryan, practical as always. "Are you coming to dinner tonight? Mom's making pasta." Christopher looked at Amanda over the children's heads, and she nodded. "If your mom says it's okay." "It's okay." Amanda's voice was warm. "Your family, Christopher. Broken and rebuilt, but family." Jacob, who'd been quiet, spoke up with the seriousness he brought to important observations. Does this mean you and Mom are getting back together? Amanda and Christopher spoke simultaneously, "No." Then they looked at each other and laughed, a sound that felt foreign and wonderful. "We're friends," Amanda explained to Jacob. "Partners in running this company and raising you three. But some things can't be fixed by going backward. What we have now is better than what we had before. It's built on truth instead of illusions." Christopher stood ruffling Ryan's hair. "What we have now is real, and that's worth more than anything we lost." The family of five walked out of the office together, and through the glass walls employees watched with expressions ranging from confusion to admiration to something that looked almost like hope. Manhattan glittered below them in the November evening, the city where Sarah Rodriguez had been born and abandoned and nearly destroyed, the city where Amanda Whitmore had risen and conquered and learned that revenge wasn't always about destruction. Sometimes it was about giving someone the chance to become who they were meant to be all along. It makes you wonder, how much is a second chance worth, and more importantly, who decides if someone deserves one? Have you ever experienced something like this? Have you been given a second chance you didn't deserve, or been the one deciding whether to grant forgiveness? Tell us in the comments below. And remember, the most expensive things in life aren't bought with money. They're earned with character. Justice isn't always about punishment. Sometimes it's about giving people the chance to become who they were meant to be. Christopher Hernandez lost everything: his company, his reputation, his family, because he chose ambition over integrity. But when given the opportunity to rebuild from the ground up, to earn back trust one day at a time, he discovered that the things he'd thrown away for money were the things that mattered most. Amanda Whitmore could have destroyed him completely. She had every legal, moral, and financial justification to do so. But she chose something harder: mercy that demanded accountability. She didn't give him his old life back. She gave him the chance to build a new one better than the first, founded on genuine worth rather than borrowed power. The real victory wasn't the hostile takeover or the public humiliation of those who'd wronged her. It was standing in that office with three children who loved their father, watching a man who'd been broken learn to be whole again. That's the kind of success money can't buy and power can't grant. It's earned through the slow, difficult work of choosing to be better than your worst moment. So, what do you think? Team redemption or team revenge? Did Christopher deserve that second chance, or should Amanda have left him in the dust? Drop your verdict in the comments. Because everyone has an opinion on forgiveness, but not everyone has the courage to practice it when it costs something real.